to help me with this particular item, I'd like to call on Tim and Elizabeth to also join me at the table. There's a briefing note under tab 5 of the package that you have, and I'll start with that. So in early 2016, I believe it was February, the ITK Board of Directors approved the 2016 to 2019 ITK Strategy and Action Plan. Here's a copy. In it, there were 29 identified actions with 7 objectives and committed the organization to producing 9 deliverables. We're pleased to report that we have completed the 9 deliverables that were outlined for the time period, and I'll get into that in the discussion that we'll have in a moment. Work does remain on a number of the 29 actions, and we have had considerable amount of work in each of the 7 objectives. We'll go through and just highlight some of the work that's been done to date, and I'll ask people to follow along through our annual report. And the objectives are outlined in the 2017-2018 annual report and our progress to date on them. It starts on page 10 of this document. The first objective was to take action to prevent suicide among Inuit. We have taken a number of steps in that process. Action 1.1 to advance suicide prevention efforts in Inuit Nunangat. We released the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy in July 2016. We also are supporting regional suicide prevention projects and programs that target risk factors and protective factors for suicide prevention. Action 1.2, ensure implementation of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. ITK coordinates the implementation of the NISTs with Inuit regions. We're also in the development phase of phase 2, which we hope will be funded for a 10-year period. And we hope that funding will come through budget 2019. There was a $9 million allocation on day 1 of the strategy in July 2016, and we are now in year 3 of that 3-year $9 million investment from the federal government to the implementation of the strategy. Action 1.3, work with government agencies to ensure the availability of Inuit-specific government-funded and community-based programs and services for Inuit children and families. In addition to securing the $9 million from the federal government, we've also worked with Employment and Social Development Canada and also Pagdutit and Tugasavingait Inuit to develop policy recommendations for investment and program development for the National Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework. We expect that framework will be released with corresponding investments in the very near future, perhaps as early as September. Action 1.4, provide advocacy and research supporting a continuum of culturally relevant mental wellness programs and supports throughout Inuit Nunangat. NIST activities, including all regionally funded activities, are supported through monitoring, evaluation, and learning to provide evidence-based research towards NIST implementation. We also have coordinated the translation of the mental health first aid for Inuit training materials, and we also are facilitating the implementation of that training. It's a 3-day training program, and we are pleased to be able to say that it's being delivered and the tools is being utilized, and the interpretation and the time spent is now paying off through Inuit being able to take this very important training. Action 1.5, ensure Inuit involvement in the development and delivery of public health policies, programs, and services across all Inuit communities. ITK coordinates the NIST working group and a number of other committees and working groups with participation from Inuit regional organizations to ensure that work is appropriate and responsive to regional needs. It's not just the Nunavut, just the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy implementation um, working group that does work on suicide prevention. Our National Inuit Committee on Health, our Public Health Task Group, Allied Mental Wellness, our working group. It is cross-cutting, and there are a number of different subcommittees of the ITK board that focus on aspects of suicide prevention. Also, Action 1.6, lead efforts to communicate suicide prevention measures with Inuit and Canadians as a whole. We've developed various communications tools, and we are in the final stages of creating a website. And we also are working with Inuit Kaurisarvangat and our research partners to be able to talk about suicide prevention and the work we are doing in a way that we can communicate effectively to all Inuit. We are working on an evaluation plan as well, and the results of that evaluation plan will provide a more complete story for what Inuit have done with this first phase of implementation of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. We recognize that this issue is not one that is easy to talk about. We also recognize that those who have died by suicide and those numbers alone often dictate whether or not we feel we're successful in our work. But what we are hoping to achieve in this is societal transformation, starting with social equity and providing supports and providing protective factors so that people, no matter where they are, can apprise themselves of programs and services or supports that allow for them to live better lives and allow for risk factors to be replaced by protective factors. So that means that we need to ensure that we do more for young mothers, and we need to do more in early childhood development. We need to do more to ensure that our Inuit have coping skills, and that people, Inuit who want cultural specific programming or need very specific mental health services and care, that broad spectrum of supports that Inuit need in order to live better lives, then are cumulatively working towards that end goal of reduced suicide in Inuit Nunagat and for all Inuit. I'll pause in our presentation on the strategic plan from each objective, just so that people, if they have questions, they don't have to wait for the questions to span all 7 objectives. Are there any questions or comments in relation to objective number 1, to prevent suicide among Inuit? Thank you.
This question from one of the girls, council, wondering if there's anything missing. I mean, usually we'd ask, what are you doing in regards to suicide prevention? But what we'd like to know is there anything missing or anything that's not working? But this is new, I guess, but so far, do you think there's anything missing? Anything that's not working?
The effort it has taken to coordinate our efforts across Inuit Nunagat takes time. And then the specific initiatives that each region is undertaking and how they're utilizing their specific component of the overarching federal funding also will take time to understand whether or not it's been effective. What all those involved in this have tried to do is use the money effectively for things that they know are priority areas within suicide prevention within their particular regions. Tim or Elizabeth, do you want to add just on the very specific things that are happening under the NIST funding?
Just to quickly comment in relation to Binky's question, the process of evaluation that is being ramped up now and which will take place after the first 3 years of implementation, I think is going to be critical to understanding what may or may not need to be improved in order for us to see over the long term positive outcomes resulting from the strategy. I think we're still waiting to understand where there might be gaps. In relation to the specific initiatives, I may ask Tom to comment on those if people would like more detailed information about the specific interventions that are being carried out.
It would be good just to get an overview. So Tom, if you could provide just a very quick overview of some of the initiatives that are happening. Actually, we have an agenda item, so perhaps we can wait, Binky, for that. Okay. Yeah. Almost, Tom. If there aren't further comments in relation to that, we will have a specific agenda item on suicide prevention. So go on to objective 2, which is improve access to appropriate and affordable housing in Inuit Nunangat. Action 2.1 is specific to funding, and over the past 3 budgets, 2016, 2017, and 2018, there has been a total of $817 million that's been allocated to Inuit Nunangat regions in an Inuit specific process. It was approximately $150 million in budget 2016, $240 million for Nunavut specifically in 2017, and then $400 million for the 3 other Inuit Nunangat regions in 2018. We anticipate the creation and implementation of a national Inuit housing strategy that will be finalized this fall, and hopefully we can harmonize the way in which investments happen and the allocation models within those with the federal government over time. It has been a bit of a struggle to try to pin the government down on funding investments and anticipated numbers. And so we have learned of these investments, as all Canadians do, on budget day. Whereas in other parts of our work now, we are moving beyond that process and actually are working with the federal government more explicitly to identify the amounts of funding, the funding allocations to Inuit regions, and the delivery of those funds. Action 2.2 is in relation to a discussion document on barriers to private home ownership. And we released that discussion paper in October 2016. It also impacts the content of the National Inuit Housing Strategy and its development. Action 2.3 organized the National Inuit Forum on Housing. That also happened in October 2016. We held that forum in Ontario, in Ottawa, and the outcomes of that meeting also then influence and impact the content of our upcoming strategy. Action 2.4 is in relation to the strategy and also the creation of or the implementation of a national Inuit housing program. That terminology is somewhat outdated now, since there was some concern about what that actually meant. The way in which ITK has worked with Inuit Nunangat regions is to work collectively on the issue, but then with the specific allocations, each region has different delivery models. And so we've left it up to each region to decide the way in which they would like the funds to flow when there are funding opportunities to each region. And in Action 2.5, work with regions to identify long-term suitable solutions to meet Inuit housing needs. And then that also is a key component of the Inuit Nunangat housing strategy. Unfortunately, we are seeing more overcrowding with each passing census and Aboriginal people survey data that we have. I believe the current overcrowding rate in Inuit Nunagat is 52%, which is up from 40% from just, I believe, 5 years ago. So this continues to be a crisis. It continues to be a key priority area for ITK. Are there any questions in relation to Objective 2? And we'll move to Objective 3, work towards reconciliation. Oh, sorry.
It's just the forum that happened in 2016. I'm sure that you guys compiled what was discussed during your firms. Is there a product or a result that derived from that forum? Okay.
We can recirculate the outcomes document from that forum, if that's if Makivik would like that. Okay. In relation to reconciliation, we continue to work with the TRC All Parties Committee, which was focused work under Action 3.1. It has been a challenge to get anything meaningful out of the all parties table. The work has stalled a little bit. We continue to go to those meetings and participate, but right now it's there are a number of things that just haven't happened that we had hoped would happen by now with that all parties table, especially having all the churches at that table. But we will continue to do work in relation to it. Action 3.2 is specific to Nunatsiavut, and ever since the Prime Minister apology in 2008, I believe, ITK has advocated for Nunatsiavut to be given an apology as well for residential schools. And so in November 2017, Prime Minister Trudeau delivered a settlement and an apology to Nunatsiavut survivors in Goose Bay. So that was work that was enabled by ITK's continued lobbying because of the exclusion of one of its regions from the overarching residential school settlement in 2008. Action 3.3, create and coordinate a plan that fulfills the desire by Inuit to implement the TRC's calls to action. We consider the calls to action in the advocacy work that we do, in a lot of the policy work. Government has considered the calls to action in a lot of their initiatives. We have an internal mechanism that tracks the work that we were doing in relation to the implementation of calls to action. We anticipate that we will formalize that into a product that we can regularly present to the ITK Board of Directors to show the connection between the TRC calls to action and the work that we do. A challenging factor is the TRC calls to action in many cases are First Nations focused. So there are a number of particular calls to action that are very specific to processes or rights-based situations that are exclusive to other Indigenous people in the country. So there will be holes in the work that ITK can achieve in relation to the implementation because some just do not apply at all. Action 3.4, ensure that Inuit are meaningfully engaged in the national inquiry into missing and murdering Indigenous women and girls. We have worked throughout my mandate on this particular issue. ITK does have standing at the national level and has participated in the hearings that have happened over the course of the last year and a half. And we are very fortunate to have Elizabeth Zarpa, a lawyer from Nunatsiavut, who is the legal counsel that represents ITK at the hearings and asks questions, and then feeds back all of the information to ITK and also liaises with Paututut Inuit Women of Canada on that particular file. Action 3.5 was specific to Reconciliation Canada and a partnership. Unfortunately, it hasn't been as easy to partner explicitly with Reconciliation Canada, but we have done other partnerships, and I'll just highlight again the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and the work we did to create an Indigenous Peoples Atlas, and also then the work that we have been doing with Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada to provide new wording for the Canadian Citizenship Guide and also the Citizenship Oath. That work has not been finalized, but we provided our comments to Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada a year and a half ago. So we do hope to see a revised oath and a revised citizenship guide that would be more respectful of Inuit. Objective 4 is in relation to self-determination in education. 4.1, ensuring implementation of the national strategy. The Amaliak National Center for Inuit Education is finalizing a strategic framework to implement the strategy. We also have the existing strategy and the number of things that we need to implement. So we have been working faithfully to implement. I believe there are 11 different sections within that national strategy. Action 4.2, unifying the Inuit writing system. We just had a very full discussion yesterday, and we have recommitted to this item by creating a new development team that will go on a line-by-line, task-by-task way through to the creation of the Inuit writing system. We have continued to work through the Atausik Inuit Titiausik task group. They completed their work earlier this year, and we are going to build upon the work that task group had done. And also Action 4.3, ensure implementation of the 2012 Inuit Early Learning Childhood Development Strategy. And we are working through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee to ensure implementation of the strategy and also funding for the strategy. Are there any questions on Objective 4 in education? Dwayne?
Yeah, I don't recall if you asked us those questions on Objective 3, but yeah, but I just wanted an update in regards to those really good videos we saw last year and the status of those. Like, where's the new ones, and what's the update on those?
The Inuit Nunangat Tamanangi project. Kevin, do you have the specific information about, or Patricia, around how many videos we've produced to date? Patricia D'Souza is a member of our communications team.
Thanks for the question. We have completed about more than a dozen, between 12 and 14, and we have about 8 to 10 more in production. Our plan actually was to play some during lunch today, and we had some technical problems, so we'd like to play some of the new ones tomorrow. Barry is at home today. We've given him a heads up for tomorrow.
Are there any other questions, Dwayne? If there aren't further questions on Objectives 3 and 4, we'll move to Objective 5, protect the Inuit Nunangat environment. Action 5.1, support climate change mitigation and adaptation actions for Inuit regions and communities. The National Inuit Climate Change Committee has spearheaded the development of the National Inuit Climate Change Strategy, And just yesterday at our board meeting, that strategy was approved. It will now go to final production and hopefully will be released within the next 6 to 8 weeks at the latest. December 2017, the Inuit Canada Clean Growth and Climate Change Table convened for the first time to work on joint Inuit and federal climate priorities. And that was a table that was created during a First Ministers meeting where the Pan-Canadian Framework was adopted by the Government of Canada and provinces and territories. Because there was no Inuit specific component of that adoption, the Prime Minister had promised and agreed to create an Inuit specific table to implement the Pan-Canadian Framework. And we've worked through our senior technical staff with departments responsible for the implementation of the Pan-Canadian Framework through this table on actions that we can do moving forward. We also have ensured effective engagement of Inuit through going to the Conference of the Parties, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have gone to each of the last three and work hand in hand with Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada and other Arctic Indigenous peoples. Our role is specifically to ensure that Canada's positions that are taken in these international agreements are seen through the domestic lens. With ICC Canada, the role is similar but different in that the processes undertaken internationally and across Inuit Nunat are the larger focus for ICC and ICC Canada. And ITK plays that niche role in the international conversations to ensure that domestically Canada is living up to whatever it says internationally. We also continue to participate in the work of the National Climate Change Adaptation Platform. And that's another opportunity for Inuit to put our perspectives forward. Action 5.2, coordinate strategic activities and outreach that protect our way of life in relation to wildlife management. And our food systems and the support of harvesting activities and access to wild foods are central to the climate change strategy and also ITK's work in the implementation of the Inuit Canada Clean Growth and Climate Change Table. Action 5.3 was in relation to the development of a national approach to certifying, branding, and marketing sustainable Inuit wildlife products for domestic and international trade. We haven't made as much progress as we might like on that particular item, but we have continued to advocate for these changes to improve access to market for our Inuit artists and seamstresses and those who want to sell our products like fur. We also have supported the Inuit Art Foundation to ensure the continued use of the Igloo tag to certify the authenticity of Inuit-made products. And the Igloo tag now is housed directly under the Inuit Art Foundation, and they're using federal funds to rejuvenate and rebrand that particular tag. Any questions in relation to Objective 5? Objective 6 is strengthening Inuit self-determination. Sorry, Dwayne?
Maybe you're not able to answer this right now, but if it's under the Inuit Art Foundation, what are they going to do for outreach eventually to make the regions more aware that they should be working with them to get that Inuit logo put on their Inuit art? Just as example of the guy that was selling his crafts here earlier, I would say that Don does not know if he wants to promote his Inuit art further and beyond that, he would need that logo on his. So I'm hoping the Art Foundation is working on some kind of awareness and outreach and education and promotion to better inform all of the individual artists that are out there to get that brand put on their products.
I don't have an answer, but generally we have a good relationship with the Inuit Art Foundation, and we can ask that question and get specific clarification, so that we all know what the Inuit Art Foundation plans to do, especially with outreach and communication and incorporation of individual Inuit and Inuit businesses to rebrand the igloo tag. Jerry?
My question is to our waters, or the Northwest Passage, and that they're allowed to dump gray water in our area, and that'll affect our environment. And how can we stop that? Like, and they only there's bylaws says that they won't, but I would prefer a law saying you can't dump in the Arctic.
I understand. I know that there's work internationally being done in relation to heavy fuel oil and also any bilge-related dumping in the Arctic. Specifically, I don't have the information, but it is again something that ITK can research and look into and work with ICC Canada to report back and possible actions and interventions that we can propose moving forward. Okay, we'll move to objective 6, which is strengthen Inuit self-determination and research. Action 6.1, collect, verify, and disseminate Inuit-specific data, statistics, and research to appropriate stakeholders. The first step in that is in relation to a strategy on how that all happens, and we launched our strategy in March 2018, and we have just approved the implementation plan at yesterday's board meeting. We also, in 2017-2018, have developed an Inuit statistical profile, which is available, I believe, on our website, and we can distribute it if people are interested. Action 6.2, ensure continued organization, preservation, and sharing of Inuit-specific knowledge and information. There have been a number of things that we have done in relation to this. We have created a National Inuit Data Management Committee. We also have launched Niliayut 2, which is a video on Inuit perspectives of the Northwest Passage. We've continued development of the ITK library and are prepared to launch library services to the public in September 2018. This is a project that has been ongoing for some time, but we have only in the last 2 years created the physical space, and we now have a corresponding electronic database for the holdings. We do hope to expand into archives as well, so all of ITK's archive material can be available to anyone who is interested in that as a research topic. And if you can imagine, our archive will span back to 1971. And over the course of ITK's history, we've done a lot of things that are instrumental in a number of different land claim regions. So having that information available is going to be, I think, really helpful for continuity and an understanding of our past that will help us understand our present and then help us push towards future goals. Action 6.3, develop partnerships to create a sustainable Inuit health survey. In January 2018, ITK supported Nunavut, the Inuvik Regional Settlement Region, and Nunatsiavut to initiate a reconsent process with 2,500 participants from the 2007-2008 Inuit Health Survey. We also have secured $82 million over 10 years and then $6 million ongoing after those 10 years in the 2018 federal budget for the creation of a permanent sustainable Inuit Health Survey. We have an Inuit Health Survey working group that is working on the particulars of how to create that sustainable Inuit Health Survey. We also recognize that Nunavik has done 2 iterations of a health survey, and they are working productively and in full cooperation with other Inuit regions so as to merge the data sets in the coming Inuit Health Survey iterations. So we all got to this place in different ways, and we're hoping to have a base of work of stable funding, and then also an understanding of the shared questions of a national Inuit Health Survey, and then there will be regional specificity for specific regional questions that need to be answered. Are there any questions on or comments on Objective 6? Dwayne?
Yeah, sorry, but some of these things are important for us. In regards to the Northwest Passage and the previous objective, what Jerry just brought up, it's I don't know if the other regions have been communicated with or invited to, but we've been working with Transport Canada to basically identify a shipping corridor throughout our region. And they're holding a workshop or a conference meeting, whatever you want to call it, next month in Ottawa. And they want to create this shipping passage throughout all of our waters, and it's to try to contain and limit where these large and medium vessels can transport through our country, through our Arctic waters. That way it's manageable, but it also ensures that you're keeping them away from sensitive sites, cultural sites, sensitive ecosystem habitat, because this is just something that takes place throughout the world where they have these shipping corridors. Alaska has already done it. Ironically, Alaska, the United States and Russia have agreed for the Bering Straits up to the community of Kotzebue so far. And they're working on the next phase of it from Kotzebue to the Canadian border. And from there, they'll work with us to identify the corridor or corridors through the ISR, and then work with Nunavut, I would assume. But I'm just raising this because that applies to those 2 objectives and those sections and those objectives. And if you're not aware of this meeting coming up, because this is our opportunity to provide input in regards to how we want shipping conducted in our areas to minimize any of the potential negative effects, but also to raise the issues that Jerry's raised in regards to gray water. You know, that's one area that's not as strong in regulation as it could be. Ballast water and other stuff cannot be dumped. But this is our opportunity, your opportunity to be engaged and provide input to develop these regulations domestically.
Thanks for that information, Dwayne. There are no further comments. I'll go to the last objective, Objective 7. That's enhance the health and well-being of Inuit families and communities. Action 7.1, to advocate for the adequate resourcing of programs, services, and initiatives that meet the needs of Inuit children and families. $42 million was allocated in March 2018 for health programming in Inuit Nunangat. And then we, as the ITK board, and through processes like the National Inuit Committee on Health, have allocated the priorities for that fund, and then have allocated the money to each individual region over a 5-year period. Action 7.2, ensure Inuit involvement in the development, design, and delivery of public health policies, programs, and services across Inuit Nunangat. In relation to this, in March 2018, ITK and the federal government jointly announced a commitment to eliminate TB by 2030 and to develop a TB elimination framework to reduce TB by 50% by 2025. We also talk about the Inuit Health Survey in relation to public health, because it directly feeds the results of that survey into then the way in which public health interventions happen. And the working group that we have designated in relation to the Inuit Health Survey is in full swing, and hopefully by the next board meeting in the fall, there will be considerations put forward to the ITK board about all of the important aspects of the renewed Sustainable Inuit Health Survey. Also in relation to urban Inuit, ITK has begun the work to create an urban advisory committee. We hope to constitute that committee with the help of key organizations who provide services and programs for Inuit across southern Canada, and ensure that urban voices are incorporated into the advice that is received by ITK that then leads directly into the decisions that the board of directors make. Action 7.3, ensure that the health accord is inclusive of and responds to Inuit health priorities. In 2018, ITK and TI coordinated 11 Inuit-specific engagement sessions across Canada to gain Inuit perspectives on health priorities, and also to determine how a renewed health accord could better meet the needs of Inuit. The health accord process ended up being a bilateral process between provinces and territories and the federal government, but in the implementation of those health accords and the monies related to them, the federal government has demanded that Indigenous priorities be included within the considerations of how provinces and territories spend those funds. And so that's the reasoning behind that work that happened across southern Canada. In Action 7.4, partner with government to identify solutions to the high cost of living in Inuit Nunangat. And we've done preliminary work in a framework to address the high cost of living in Inuit Nunangat. We have also advocated very strongly to the federal government for a renewal of the Nutrition North program that redefines the program as a subsidy first, and the consideration for country food and the consideration for ensuring that nutritious, healthy food is available at an affordable price for Inuit across Inuit Nunangat. We also have worked with Minister Duclos on the development of a poverty reduction framework, and the Inuit-specific components of that framework will speak to the high cost of living across Inuit Nunangat. That is a very broad overview, and I tried to keep it explicitly in relation to what was in the strategic plan and the actions that were within the strategic plan and what we've done. There are a host of other things that have happened over the past 3 years that have split our time in other places. The Inuit Crown Declaration and then the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee wasn't considered because it just didn't exist at the time that we created this strategic plan. Also, the legislative agenda for the federal government had not been fully understood at that particular time. It was very new in the Liberal government's mandate. And so the amount of time that we've had to spend on federal legislation, such as the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages legislation, was not anticipated as well. Otherwise, it would have been a part of our strategic plan. I'll just now give the floor to Elizabeth or Tim for anything that you'd like to add that I may have skipped over or forgotten in relation to the implementation of our strategic plan. Okay. Yes. Yeah, Mary.
ilanim ito ato so magay na kama direct scan kay na lang 6.3 atani Inuit Health Survey mitsano ta kono na living aso nuna vote nuna inureality nuna siya vote nuna vita kang nimat nuna me umiak cho ako then umiak cho ingit kakataso manuna linno how sa reaksyon ni nunni imigo ko na saman tan ITK ko ikayok si masung ito mga ta that's mga hanwilak pita health survey sutini sibo na mi ki kanay kayok si malakon sa to then umiyak chua ingit ka sinipat.
Nakumik, we just had a long discussion yesterday at the ITK board meeting about the Inuit Health Survey, and the Amundsen was actually a part of that conversation. But in relation to the first point on action 6.3, the reconsent process for the Inuvialuit, Nunavut, and Nunatsiavut survey participants is very specific to that one 2007-2008 International Polar Year funded Inuit Health Survey. So there were 10-year consent waivers that were signed. And so those consent that were signed by the participants of the Inuit Health Survey at that time in those three regions expired. And so Inuit organizations within these three regions have gone back and asked for explicit consent for another period of time so that they can still utilize their data to come up with summary data and findings, because that information is still of interest to researchers, but unless there was explicit reconsent, we couldn't ethically use the data because there was only a 10-year window. I don't believe that that was a concern within the Nunavik survey, which is why Nunavik is not included. Nunavik received funding from different sources for its two iterations of the Inuit Health Survey and had different partners. So the 2007-2008 Inuit Health Survey was a partnership between Inuit and a principal investigator at McGill, whereas Nunavik was through the Health Board and Laval, University of Laval. So we are now opening up this new world, and all four Inuit regions are talking about what the best way we move forward in concert, but also keeping regional specificity where regional specificity is needed. PJ.
Ya, ko yan na may angayok ka takwa si udlo pa makay ko yan na may rumayagi asok kay sakyan naman kagwe pinga suy kang simalutun takop ya suwe angayok juan ni si simanin si ibitiyo ngito kwat ka si bulotti abito simanyan ini sari gumadlaki kakutan na katut si katigi ini gumakatak simanin sakyan ngani ini sari gumakaw ko apat ko tinusang ulang windong una si mapat tu nga nine ngani lalo na si mamailin niya no 161 million lalo na taw si malaw si mayo tu sa pigikan niya su gumaya katan na ilin niya no asuk tay narko katigutan na inyo ilin niya si malagay kami ang inyo miti gumeli si ngulingan ayaw tukan na kuminad la kasi yung matan na naukukan ni kaya kinako si magasyo apari gumaluang waken na tama kano pang nataw si maningan itu kusikan na kumatun naksunod.
There are a number of areas to speak of, and if you look at there's a chart, I believe, on our working groups on page 5, and there are a number of education related working groups and board subcommittees, such as the National Inuit Committee on Education, the Amauyak Education Task Group, Atausik Inuk Dutituausik Task Group, the Inuit Nunangat University Task Group. And then also there's a special advisory group on post-secondary education programs review. There's also, I'm not seeing it, but yes, the National Inuit Childhood Development Working Group, which also links into early childhood development. So we have a number of subcommittees that are doing work, and each one of them has relationships with federal government counterparts on specific programs and services. We often think of assets and ISETs now, where our Inuit regional development corporations run those programs for whether it's post-secondary funding or access to the workforce, those sorts of programs. But now we are getting into early childhood development and also early learning funding and programs that we're working with the federal government on. And then in relation to post-secondary, there is also a post-secondary review where we may be able to receive more funding and specific funding that goes to Inuit organizations. We also have been working with a group of Inuit and other academics in relation to the creation of an Inuit Nunangat University. And we have the ambitious hope of being able to do all the work necessary to facilitate the creation of that institution within 5 years. So there are a whole host of different things. I've just touched the surface. Tim or Elizabeth, do you want to add to any of the work that's happening in relation to education?
Sure. Through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, one of the priorities is education, early learning, and skills development. And so the work plan beneath that priority area includes actions that we're trying to use to address K-12 challenges. One of the immediate things that we are working on through the refreshed work plan right now is drafting an Inuit teacher education action plan. You can think of that in two ways. The first is sort of like an audit of teacher education training programs and just how they're doing. So the challenges that might exist, some of the successes that might exist, and highlighting how they're working, and then also using the working group members to develop policy recommendations for leaders to consider and discuss, which would address how to strengthen the existing Inuit teacher education programs. That's just something we're working on now, but also included in that priority area are activities related to early childhood education, as well as post-secondary.
Yeah, kuyan na mitem apagi umalwa to na tema una 161 million lalo na tolo sumama kina ya sakta yun kanu inun no tan na pijaw ka sumna mga ka apagi yung ka yung kisu ni pang na simabita ilinya no mutan na to nga kasi to sinama so tan na to kusigo tigi umalwa to na talo anga jakpa.
Elizabeth, do you have specifics on, it's the skills training, the 161 million over 5 years that PJ is referencing? ISETs. So that's specifically the ISETs program and all of the different initiatives that fall under that particular ISETs program. Does that clarify? Okay, great. Are there any other comments in relation to the content on the implementation of the strategic plan? We're nearing the end of the term for the strategic plan, so I would anticipate that by the next AGM, ITK may have a new strategic plan that will span the next 3 years. As with all of our strategic plans, many of the items, the overarching items remain the same, such as education and housing and language. But the specific work that we can do and the imagination of what is possible in the next 3 years obviously has changed from when we drafted this first in January of 2016. Thank you, Elizabeth and Tim. We'll now move into the next item. Children in care. And I'll ask Tom Sheldon to come to the floor. These next two items, items 6 and 7, are items that have been federal government priority areas and have been items that that ITK and other Indigenous peoples have pushed for. The Children in Care and the Child First Initiative were discussed at the special meeting that happened in early 2018 in relation to children in care. There was an Inuit specific section of that meeting, and part of what we're going to discuss today is the follow-up from those conversations that we had with Minister Philpott at that time. Tom?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Natan. So with respect to the children in care file, there's been some fairly significant developments over the past month, and we thought it was important to bring it to this table for an update. As we all know, there's an overrepresentation of Inuit children and youth in child welfare systems. And if a child or youth is not able to access services such as foster care, residential care, so on and so forth within their community, they are sometimes sent to another community or even out of their region to access those services. We also know that there's very limited information to determine exactly how many Inuit children and youth are in care, where they are located, either within the region or in another province or territory, and the reasons why they are in care. That is a barrier that we need to address in order to make the necessary systemic changes to reduce the number of Inuit children and youth in care and avoid cultural loss by ensuring strong efforts are made to ensure Inuit children remain in Inuit homes and Inuit communities. So very recently, and this is within the last month, less than the last month, the Government of Canada approached ITK on developing federal legislation on child welfare reform. And it isn't a perfect analogy to use, but we all know that child welfare systems and the services through those are delivered from provinces and territories. But the analogy to use would be something like the Canada Health Act, where there's overarching federal legislation, even though that service is delivered at a provincial and territorial level. So the Government of Canada is proposing to run a consultation process that they wanted to kick off in July and run until September 2018. Our immediate feedback at the national level was that's an extremely ambitious timeline, and that needs to be taken into account. But they're aiming to run that consultation process, and it's still very loosely defined, and then have a wraparound meeting that would be held in October 2018. And this engagement process is meant to clarify whether co-created, and they're using the term co-creation, federal legislation would be a useful tool? And if so, what should it actually look like? And as I said before, their timeline is extremely ambitious. They're proposing to table high-level legislation by late October, early November, with more detailed regulations following that. Priority Area 3 of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy notes that ITK will advocate for children protective services that put the needs of children first by providing responsive foster placements when needed, providing environments for children in care that maintain connections with culture and community, and providing a full range of supports for vulnerable families that maximize the success of keeping children and families united. So we're at the very initial stages of consultation, or this has been proposed to us very recently. We're at the very initial stages of engagement. But as I said before, the timelines are extremely ambitious. The driver for those timelines is to get this onto the legislative agenda prior to the Christmas break, so during the fall sitting of Parliament, so that it can run through the legislative course before the end of this Liberal government's life, which we know is in fall 2019. So that's the driver for this. Immediately upon hearing this, we worked through the National Inuit Committee on Health to get regional contacts that we could work with, and that the federal government could, and that we could engage to provide the federal government with some guidance on this particular issue. I'm happy to report that we have regional contacts from every region now that we are working with on this issue. There isn't any resolution in terms of exact process going forward, but the fact that we are able to mobilize and coordinate in a very quick time to pull a bit of an ad hoc working group together on this so that we can have a national and regional level cohesive voice on this it's been very useful, and I think that speaks to the good sort of committee and subcommittee process and communication that we have happening within the Policy Advancement Department and at a regional level. Also, we know that, and in your briefing note, it speaks to it, that there's an Ontario Child, Youth and Family Services Act that was newly proclaimed in April 2018. And it recognizes Inuit as distinct peoples in the province. So to our knowledge, that's the first time that has happened in such legislation that doesn't involve a region of Inuit Nunavut. And that legislation is going to that act is going to take place or take effect in July 2019. So ITK is playing a role, and we're using the same representatives from regions to have this conversation about the Ontario Child, Youth and Family Services Act and how best we could work with the government of Ontario to ensure that Inuit children and youth are better taken care of if they are under the jurisdiction of, or in the jurisdiction of the government of Ontario. So these are two files, in particular, the federal legislative file, the proposed legislation reform, that are moving fairly quickly. We wanted to put it to this table to provide an update right away because it is such an important file for all regions. And we're thankful to each one of your representatives for engaging so quickly on such an important issue. So I can take any questions from there if you have any. I try. I told the makeup people to take care of that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. got in before Alaki, I guess, but our point person is Evelyn, but we know that it's going to become legal as well on drafting up legislation, and that's why we need the capacity to deal with this. This to me is like the Language Act. It's a once in a lifetime sort of opportunity for us to get national legislation, working directly with the federal government to develop this legislation that reflects how we want to see this initiative undertaken with us to ensure that our kids are have the proper protections, rights, mechanisms along with us. And this is a very ambitious time frame, but we're going to have to accept it if we want to see this get passed and done with this government, because, like you're saying, they're going to end up breaking 6 months before elections. That's the practice. So they're going to want to get this passed by Parliament and all that process by this spring at the very latest. So we're talking very quickly here. But I see the urgency and the need for us to get this in place, because we've been playing second fiddle, I guess, too long in regards to the well-being of our children. Our area has had the Auditor General do evaluations, and they haven't been, basically the grade has been an F in regards to where are our kids in this territory. So that's disturbing at the very least. So we need to become more proactive as Inuit organizations and for the well-being of our children, and this is the mechanism to do so. So I think that we're prepared to provide the capacity to get this legislation through and give it the support that it needs.
Kumik Dwayne, Aluki?
Ayan, Naming. I have a comment or question in terms of specifically about the Ontario Children, Youth and Family Services Act, and the comment made that it will be the first time that there's distinction about Inuit that's outside of Inuit Nunanga. And one of the, I guess we're going to have to figure out how we're going to work through that. And I know it's something that's an emerging issue that we keep talking about at our different tables in terms of the increase of urban Inuit living outside of Inuit Nunangat. And Inuit, regardless of if they live in our settlement area, are still part of the agreements that we have. Like, for instance, in Nunavut, any Inuk who's enrolled under the Nunavut agreement, regardless of if they live in Nunavut or not, remain Nunavut Inuit according to our agreement. So I know that our staff at Social and Cultural Department have been informed about the Ontario Act, and that NTI will have to be involved in to some extent. And I think it's still not clear what that will mean and how involved and what will be required is still not clear. But one of the things I was thinking about, and it might already be, information might already exist in terms of the Inuit living in Ontario. What is the makeup of that? Are they mostly Nunavut Inuit? Or, I mean, I think that would be a very useful place to start, is to figure out the makeup of the Inuit living in urban settings, and particularly in this jurisdiction where they will have legislation for Inuit that specify Inuit. I think that would be important for us to determine how involved we get. And I know internally as NTI board, we've started discussions about how we need to be more cognizant and think about urban Inuit, because we are aware that the urban Inuit population is growing.
So I think both of your points are very well taken. I think the recognition of Inuit in this act allows the opportunity for a rights-based approach in service delivery within the province of Ontario. So I think that is a really good thing. With respect to the makeup of Inuit in Ontario, there's no definitive numbers on that. We have an indication from TI out of Ottawa that the majority are from Nunavut, but we don't have that definitive makeup and those definitive numbers. And that's one of the things that I think we need to work through over the next sort of 11 months before this comes into effect in order to best allocate our resources and our capacity.
Gerald?
Thank you, Nathan. That's excellent work, Tom. I was very surprised at this as well. Michelle is the deputy minister, and she informed me on this yesterday. So when I've seen it as well, like Dwayne said, it's very sharp, a very fast timeline, but very important, which I agree with. And I've seen some of the sample questions. My biggest concern is logistically, how are you going to get, the community feedback in that short period of time, where many communities are spread out so far?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the group that we've just assembled, but I think we'd be leaning on expertise from the regions to try to ensure that that happens as efficiently as possible. I know in Nunatsiavut, Michelle Kinney is highly knowledgeable and really effective at getting community input, and we have similar folks from other regions. So ambitious, but I think this is a good problem to have in this particular case. So we'll lean on expertise from regions as much as possible, and we will support those individuals from regions as much as possible as well.
If I may take the mic again, I would, it's obvious ITKs could need to have legal capacity. I'm surprised we don't have more of that within ITK already with everything that's been going on the last couple of years. But we've been communicating, as an example, with British Columbia, who recently created their own legislation, and they've recognized that. And when I say they communicate with us, because we have beneficiaries there, the Yukon communicates with us, Alberta, Saskatchewan reaches out to us when it involves our beneficiaries. The reason I point out BC, Tom, it's probably a good example of legislation to look at. I'm not the lawyer, but it's fairly reflective of Indigenous rights, and we all know there's many different First Nations there as well. But I just want to go back to the federal umbrella. What the provinces and territories eventually do, like you were saying, like you use the health system as an example. When federal legislation comes in, then there are boundaries and limitations that the provinces can do within their respective jurisdictions, but they have to stay within that federal limitation to some degree. And so if we're able to get this legislation at this level, then that will alleviate a lot of the questions and concerns that Alec is asking about, because we would have the same question as well. Well, how many Inuit do we have in Ontario? Our enrollment person could probably tell me that, but again, it's besides the point. The key thing, again, like I say, is just like the language legislation. If we can get this one right at that level, then all of the others have to eventually fall into place. So this is the crucial part of it. And in regards to the time frame, we're just going to have to try to keep our communities best informed as possible. But for us, anything is better than what we have right now in this regard.
Rebecca?
Clearly. We had the same problem when we were trying to get numbers for Inuit women who have been murdered and are missing. We couldn't get the exact numbers And I think this goes way back when the TB epidemic was rampant in our communities. We have relatives that we lost down south. We don't know where they're buried. But this, when it comes to children, I think we really have to work together. This is urgent.
Andy?
Yeah, very shortly, on our site, I was just told that these files are constantly changing and very, very fast. And on our site, we have a legal team, and we are very much on watch and keeping track also, and pretty much on the same page as much as possible too. So yes, it is right from a couple of months ago. Speaking on behalf of the president again, it was one of his very much concern about our child care and the DYP and how that is affecting our livelihood, our families, and some were even saying that this is the new residential school, and I'm sure that we are very much on guard and trying to look at what the changes that we may be happening, and for hopefully for the better.
Uncle Meek, I think there's broad support for trying to make this work, and ITK working with Inuit regions through whatever is to come on this particular file. I'm sure that we will work closely with Minister Philpott on this file and her political staff, and then her department as well. We have had a good working relationship with them, which then makes me feel like we have an opportunity here that we can capitalize on. Nakomik. The next item is also within Minister Philpott's purview in relation to the Child First Initiative. Inuit were excluded from Jordan's principle, and the federal government had accepted Jordan's principle, I believe, a number of years ago now. And there, for a long time, there was a gray area for Inuit. The federal government didn't say that Inuit were eligible or not eligible for Jordan's principle, but starting at about a year to a year and a half ago, the federal government started responding to all Inuit individuals who applied for funding under Jordan's principle with letters saying that they were not eligible because they were Inuit. That then kicked off our advocacy to the federal government demanding that Inuit be included in Jordan's principle. And that then led to the federal government agreeing to create an alternative, an Inuit specific alternative under the same principles as Jordan's principle. So here's what we have now is an understanding just on a high level of what this alternative may be, and then also the work to get to the end result, which hopefully will create some very meaningful opportunities for Inuit in relation to overarching health. Tom?
Thank you, Natan. Okay, so to kick off and build on what Natan just mentioned, the goal of Jordan's principle as it stands is to ensure substantive equality for First Nations children specifically, and that's achieved through timely provision of services in education, health, and social domains or areas. Jordan's principle, many people mistakenly think that it's limited to jurisdictional disputes between on-reserve and off-reserve First Nations, or to provincial, territorial, and federal disputes regarding responsibility for payment. It's not limited. It's also not limited to children with serious complex disability or medical needs. It's meant to ensure that all First Nations children can access appropriate supports when they need them. The federal government is legally obligated to implement Jordan's Principle. And the provincial and territorial governments, although not legally obligated, are morally obligated to the implementation of the principle. It's a principle as opposed to a program. So it's a principle that affects all programming is an important thing about it. And although there's funding associated directly with the Child First initiative, Jordan's Principle itself has unlimited funding. So the federal government can't pull funding for it from other health and social programming. Implementation by the federal government, I won't talk about that again. Natan mentioned that and talked about it. But Inuit requests for coverage under Jordan's Principle have been denied in the past. Just to give you a scope of the understanding of Jordan's Principle as it applies to First Nations currently, it's been in effect since July 2016. And from July 2016 to June 30th, 2018, we wanted the latest numbers available. There was more than 99,000 requests that were approved under Jordan's Principle. That time period reflects the Child First Initiative funding envelope of over $382 million, which is coming to an end in March 2019. So it's not a small amount of funding that is being put forward for Jordan's Principle for First Nations. Getting back to what is covered, I talked about it's not just limited to sort of medical needs, and it's not just limited to complex disability or those sorts of things. So it includes educational supports. It includes allied healthcare. So when examples of that, speech and language pathologist assessment, chiropractic assessment, occupational therapy assessment. It includes allied health therapy. So examples of that, dietitians, osteotherapy. It includes things like clinical care for general practitioner specialist services. So things like audiology, pediatric assessment. It includes also provisions for dental and vision clinical care. It includes provisions for mental health support. So that includes mental health assessment. So things like autism assessment, cognitive assessment, mental health therapy. So it includes things like art therapy, play therapy, music therapy, psychiatrists. It includes social and educational supports. So things like respite. In the past, for First Nations, it has included things like basketball and hockey registration, car seats, specialized summer camps, personal support workers. It includes educational support, so things like teacher's aid, tuition, tutors, books, and also adaptive equipment and supplies, so things like electronic assistive communication devices. In some cases, it's included tablets that are required for any sort of educational or medical needs. And it has included things like home or public infrastructure in the past. So things like van conversions, housing modifications, those sorts of things. So the scope of coverage under Jordan's Principle, generally, in my experience, is much broader than what the average person thinks of Jordan's Principle as. And I think it's important when we have this conversation to fully understand that. In terms of who can make a request, requests can be made on an individual level, but also groups or communities can apply. So a community could put forward a request under Jordan's Principle. And in the past, First Nation groups have successfully requested funds to set up and maintain childcare centers or related to community health centers. One of the hallmarks of Jordan's Principle is the rapid response times. So in the current context with First Nations, there's a 24-hour call service that's available for requests under Jordan's principle. It's staffed by focal points that are regionally based. Once a request has been made, there's a 48-hour window for a decision to be made and a response sent. The focal point that is the initial contact doesn't actually have the ability or the authority to approve the request, or they have the authority to approve the request. They don't have the authority to deny the request. That denial only resides at an assistant deputy minister level within Indigenous Services Canada. So if they feel that focal point feels it should be not denied, it's escalated to the assistant deputy minister level. So that's some of the background on Jordan's principle. So as Natan mentioned, Inuit were previously ineligible to apply. As a result, the president sent a letter to the Prime Minister's office requesting that the government of Canada apply the full scope of Jordan's principle to Inuit. And that policy has recently been reversed. So this new approach, so funding will be provided under the Child First Initiative for Inuit on an interim basis until an Inuit specific approach can be developed with Inuit partners. That new approach covers all Inuit children recognized by an Inuit land claim organization, regardless of where they live. While the requests aren't technically considered Jordan's principal requests, and therefore aren't subject to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, the operating procedures established under Jordan's principle will be used until Inuit specific materials can be created. We're working so this is one of those things that has happened very recently, and it's less than 2 months old, but again, the National Inuit Committee on Health has mobilized representatives regionally very quickly that are working with us in order to work through that interim process and on a more long-term basis, create that Inuit-specific longer-term process that is equivalent to Jordan's principle. So I just mentioned some of this that's on that slide. So we're working with those representatives from regions right now for an engagement plan and procedures for including Inuit children under the Child First Initiative. And as with everything, we will bring those things back to the National Inuit Committee on Health and the ITK Board of Directors as we move forward. But this is, it's going to be a lot of work, but it's good work that we can collaboratively do, and it's a good opportunity for Inuit, and in particular for Inuit children and youth, to have substantive equality in the services that are available to them across Inuit Nunangat, but also outside of it. I'll leave it there and take any questions you may have.
Dwayne.
Thanks, Tom, for that very detailed update. I don't recall seeing any information or correspondence from ITK informing us that it has been reversed. If you could send us a copy of the correspondence that you have from the government so that we have that on file. The reason I say that is if it comes up with us, with our own region and this interim provision, so that we can bring that to the minister's attention. Secondly, how long is this interim measure in place? And I would think that drafting up the criteria wouldn't be too much different than what has already been developed under the Jordan's principle, but be more specific to certain issues such as isolation with Inuit communities, etc., to reflect the realities of where we reside in geography.
So in terms of perhaps the terminology, I shouldn't use the term reversal. It's just that Inuit now are scoped in for coverage under the Child First Initiative, whereas before they weren't. With respect to the criteria, we've been working already the time frame. So yes, the time.
And also, I'm sorry to cut you. Also, is there an explicit letter or what method of communication? Part of this conversation is also the timing of the ITK election and the interest in the government of Canada to not interfere with the ITK election. So some of these announcements, these initiatives that are about to be announced have been linked. The government's hands have been tied, in their words, by not wanting to interfere with Indigenous organizational leadership processes.
Well, I'm not, I mean, if this is something, I have a call with my health minister during break, and I want to make sure that he's aware of this issue so that I don't have to, if we have one of our children in this territory that needs to be applicable, Jordan's principle needs to apply to them, I don't want to have to argue with them about it. I just need to point out the correspondence that's saying, here's the information from the federal government, bill them back for that purpose. I mean, we've had to do that on other cases as well.
So definitely noted about that in terms of communication, and we're hopeful that our regional representatives that within the land claim regions can really reach out to, and we'll support them doing this, to territorial and provincial counterparts to ensure that there's communication into those circles too. And I know that's already started in a couple regions. I'm unsure of the GNWT. In terms of timing, the interim this interim window is till the end of March 2019, at which point we hope that more long-term coverage will be in place under the Child First Initiative. But we wanted, and Indigenous Services Canada wanted to ensure that there was coverage right away. So that's why that interim process is starting right away.
Luki?
Thank you, Natan. It's not specific to Jordan's principle, but is kind of going back to the agenda item where we spoke about the Child and Family Services legislative reform. And I just wanted to comment that similar to the experience we've had with the Indigenous languages legislation, I would hope that since it's such a short time frame, that I would hope that we engage with a legal firm and we have lawyers involved to provide provisions, draft provisions, so that we can actually be part of the co-developing the reform that the federal government wants to take. I think that would be important so that we're pragmatic and moving forward in a positive way rather than having technical discussions without having lawyers there. So I just wanted to make that as a comment. Thanks.
Are there any other comments? Pinky?
Tom, did you say that they didn't want to announce it? Like, are they waiting to announce the inclusion of Inuit in the Jordan's principle?
From my understanding, at the last Inuit Crown Partnership Committee meeting, Minister Philpott communicated that Inuit children would be covered under the Child First Initiative as part of that discussion. There hasn't been broad-based public communication that I'm aware of, but it's...
So at the last Inuit Crown Partnership Committee meeting here in Inuvik, Minister Philpott stated to Inuit leadership that Inuit would now be eligible under the Child First Initiative. On the communications out from that meeting, in the media that I did, I mentioned that. It did make it to a couple of news sources, but the federal government has not announced this formally with Inuit as of yet, and has not communicated this widely as of yet. This is coming, but but the announcement has already happened to Inuit through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee. So it's just the dissemination of information and also the interim measures on the eligibility and where to go that will be coming shortly. This does have the potential to provide a new source of funding for some very important care that can be delivered to our population, which also fits within the overarching holistic way in which we see health, whether it's through education or physical health or mental health or community health. Hopefully, we'll be able to give our children another level of care and opportunity through this that we cannot give them as of today. Are there any other questions in relation to this item? We look forward to working with our Inuit regions and our board organizations on this issue moving forward. The last item before our break will be under tab 8, and it's just an update of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. I got into that a little bit within the update on our strategic plan, but Tom has more explicit updates for what we've been doing recently.
Thank you very much again. So as many people around the table are aware, the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy is a holistic approach to suicide prevention that focuses on intervening and providing support much earlier in life so that individuals are less likely to reach the point where they consider suicide. The evidence-based approach to suicide prevention considers the entire lifespan of the individual, as well as what can be done to provide support for families and individuals in the wake of adverse experiences that we know increase suicide risk. As a result, ITK, in partnership with the regions through the strategy, outlined 6 priority areas for action and investment, and they are listed on the screen there. Creating social equity, creating cultural continuity, nurturing healthy Inuit children, ensuring access to a continuum of mental health wellness or mental wellness services for Inuit, healing unresolved trauma and grief, and finally mobilizing Inuit knowledge for resilience and suicide prevention. Inuit regions themselves, and there was a specific question from Binky earlier about specific programming that's happening in regions. So we thought that we would update so that each region has an understanding of what other regions are also doing. So this is an example of a pot of money, what we termed collectively the Mental Wellness Enhancement Fund under the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. And it gives the region and the types of programs that they're running. So within the Inuvik settlement region, there's programming around parenting, around assist, which is applied suicide intervention skills training. There's substantive funding going towards youth programming and also mental health first aid. Within Nunavut, there's programming around reclaiming the whole man. And the goal of that program is to promote intergenerational learning, healing, alongside resilience and strength in a gender-specific way. There's programming for Our Life's Journey, which is to increase the availability of culturally and linguistically relevant counseling services in Nunavut. And then there's also a parenting and child rearing program, which speaks to revitalizing traditional wisdom around the making of a human being in the lives of families today. In Nunavik, there's programming on the land-based programming, and there's also mental health first aid that's happening. And then in Nunatsiavut, there's work around sexual violence prevention and outreach, and that specifically also works with sexual offenders. And there's work around equipping youth, adults, and the general community to engage in healthy sexual relationships and increase service provider and community capacity to address sexual violence. There's also, through NISP, support for a Nain Youth Center that is open, in fact, all hours of the night, so that youth have a safe place to go if they are vulnerable and don't have anywhere else to go. That's the first type of fund that rolled out through the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. Subsequent to that, there's been another fund going into regions, and that's called the Regional Innovation Fund. And this Regional Innovation Fund, the first fund, was much broader and it had very broad parameters. This one, the National Inuit Committee on Health, chose to focus specifically on nurturing healthy Inuit children and risk factors for suicide associated with childhood development. And we see a host of programs happening across regions. I won't go through all of them again, but you can see, for example, in Nunavik, they're going to be using this funding for fly-in sexual abuse intervention team across all communities. And in Nunatsiavut, for example, they're developing service delivery model that will connect vulnerable children with appropriate clinical services in a more efficient manner. So oftentimes people ask, how is this funding actually affecting programming on the ground? And through these two funds, we can see it being pressed down to a regional and a community level in terms of the type of work that's being done. And some of that work is getting really to the heart of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy on dealing with things like risk factors and also nurturing healthy children. In terms of priorities for this year, previously at a board meeting, there was direction and agreement to hold a broad-based national dialogue and national forum on the prevention of child sexual abuse. We know that is a major risk factor for suicide. And so that national level discussion will happen in fall 2018, likely in November. The dates aren't settled, but it may happen coinciding with National Day of the, or International Day of the Child. And that'll be a very important dialogue and a very important marker for implementation of phase 1 of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. Recently, we also engaged National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy Working Group, and that's specifically to increase interregional communication, but also national regional communication. This group meets, it hasn't happened over the summer because of holidays and that, but this group meets bi-weekly, actually. So every second week they get together and they talk about suicide and suicide prevention and the work happening under the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. So that working group has been extremely helpful to us at a national level to better understand and better work with regions in relation to suicide prevention. We have an important component that's been running for a while now, and that's monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And that isn't just focused on a national level. We have a monitoring, evaluation, and learning team that is actually going out to regions and working with the teams that are implementing each of the initiatives under the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. So we have a common monitoring framework, and we can roll up and report that regionally and then nationally to be able to better understand impact and outcomes associated with this first phase of funding. So that's well underway. That team has traveled, I believe it's multiple times to every region. I know it's been at least once to every region, working with the various teams implementing these programs. And we really believe in evidence-based approaches, and so we believe in monitoring and evaluation associated with this is something that's critical in order to inform how we're making investments in relation to suicide prevention. We're also doing an evaluation of the mental health first aid Inuit training. So that's been delivered, it's being delivered across all regions. And it's actually there's actually a course happening today at ITK offices. And we're using that as an opportunity to learn about the program or to learn about that training and to evaluate it and hopefully improve it over time. As Natan mentioned before, this is the final year of the first phase of funding for the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. There was 3 years of funding. Really, in practicality, the announcements, we've been working basically for 2 years on this now because the announcement was at the end of July 2016. So we will be with that working group actually over the next couple months trying to co-develop a proposal for phase 2 of the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy that will include an implementation plan that would begin April 1st. So hopefully there can be seamless continuity building on the work that's happening in phase 1. Nunavik is actually just begun a process of developing their own regional suicide prevention strategy, and we're supporting them quite a lot at a national level. We will have a couple staff actually traveling to Nunavik next week to have further dialogue with Nunavik. And this is where we get good alignment and complementarity from a national to a regional and then community level around how suicide prevention strategies are developed and then how implementation takes place from them. So we are extremely grateful and glad to be working with Nunavik on that. And then we're still working on the finalization of the Inuit Suicide Prevention website, but communications over this next what's essentially a 9-month period is going to be a heavy emphasis of the work that we do, both through website, but also other tools. So we'll be doing a fair amount of communication work as well. I didn't want to take up too much of your time, but that'll give you a flavor for what's happening at a regional level, but also what's happening at a national level with the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. It's only been 2 years, but the amount of work that each of your regions has put into this isn't small, and it's been a learning process over time, but I think we're learning and we're improving over time, and as you can see, there's a lot of things happening, and we hope to grow that into phase 2. So with that, I'll take any questions from folks.
Becky.
I'm just wondering about the flying sexual abuse intervention team in Nunavik, how that works, because I'm always leery about these fly-ins if there's nothing in place in the community to deal with aftermath of a fly-in. You know, it's pretty scary what, you know, for more suicides to happen.
So a couple things is I can connect you for sure with the individual at in Nunavik that's leading that. One of the things that we're doing with all programs, again, is that monitoring evaluation component. So we'll be learning through implementation, and that'll be able to better give information in relation to your question.
PJ?
Ya, kuyan nami natanam kuyan nami tanaw ni Katya Kavin. Pilih ya si mayun, parna tahu si mayun pure theater, abis tu si mayun, apa rigo mayun adle. Sila tani tahu tu kutigo ini usah mani kipisingin sama ngata tu kusigo mayun. Tana utu tigiga kakatigo, piju tigiga tigo tas mga tu kusigo mayun. Kanu iling ako igo makia. Atu te kakalwa mga tatakwa pilih ya tabuna. Tu kusinam na kumang.
That is a question that's asked all the time. Basically, how can you show success, especially if the rate of death by suicide has not decreased dramatically or appreciably at all from the time you started to now? And the first caveat is that suicide prevention and somebody who ultimately dies by suicide, they're in that work, and then in that individual, or there are all sorts of different factors. If you look at it from a population base, we have a high rate of suicide ideation, those who are thinking of suicide at any given time. We then have a number of people who attempt suicide, and the attempt rate is much higher than the Canadian average. And then we also have those who have died by suicide. The difference between an attempt and a completion sometimes could be random chance. Somebody who is seen by somebody else in that moment. And in such a small communities, that is sometimes the difference between another death or somebody who just attempted and was able to receive care. So that's at the end, and sometimes we only focus on that particular moment in time when a large portion of our population live every day with challenges to mental health. And many of our people may think of suicide from time to time. So what we're hoping to do through this work is to provide the social equity, that broad-based foundation, which are known as protective factors that allow for people to live better lives so that they don't ever get into a place where they have mental health disorders or depression or other risk factors that lead to attempts or lead to death by suicide. We also know that for people who have gone through difficult times, the things that they need to cope with their life experiences allow for them to live longer, allow for them to live healthier lives. And those numbers don't come into the deaths by suicide. So with the monitoring, evaluation, and learning that we have about the work that we're doing, it will be able to tell the story in a new way. So we're not just looking at that number of those who have died by suicide, we are also looking at the effectiveness of the programs, the services, the interventions that we've been able to do, and the positive effect that has on the mental health of our population, so that many more people never turn to suicide in the first place. It's such a hard thing to know, because we only know when somebody either attempts or completes usually. And the things that we're trying to do create a new life path, especially for youth, especially for young people and those who care for them. If we know that, say, for coping skills, we know that coping skills are learned in many ways. So we know that if we create programs that provide coping skills to our young people, then they will use those coping skills throughout their life. Because everyone goes through hard times, and when you go through hard times, if you have a skill set that allows you to get through it, that then helps you your entire life. If you don't have it, then that might lead you on a path towards suicide. So all of these random occurrences, if you will, that we are trying to pinpoint interventions that we think will help in the large picture, will, I hope, all come into focus through our evaluation. But we don't have any evidence right now that between the time we've started our work and now, that there are less Inuit who have died by suicide as a result. We do know that we are doing good things that create protective factors for Inuit that allow them to live healthier lives and allow for them to have the skills to be able to cope with adverse life experiences. And we hope through monitoring and evaluation that we can tell that story in a way that makes us, I guess, believe in this method of suicide prevention.
Hi. I'd like to know what determines the funding for each region. And I noticed like Nunavik has the least amount of suicide prevention programs. And I saw that on both slides there was one of the same on the land-based program. I just wanted to get more details on that.
So the funding through both of those initiatives that goes into each region is the same level of funding. So in Nunavik's case for the On the Land programming, they simply made the decision to put more funding into that specific program as opposed to funding that or using that pot of money into multiple programs. In many cases in regions, the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy funding isn't the only source of funding associated with suicide prevention. So they're using other sources of funding in addition to the NISP's funding to run these initiatives. But it's the same level of funding that has gone across each region. $9 million over 3 years is not a small amount of money, but it's once you talk about the size of Inuit Nunavut and the scope of the challenge, it's also not a large amount. One of the things that we're hoping for through phase 2 of NISP's funding is that there can be a longer time period for that funding and an increased amount per year.
I've also noticed in the past 2 years, there have been a lot of suicides in Inuvik. I went in Kujak, there was a urgent get together. Sorry. There was I can't, I'm sorry.
Dwayne?
No, take your time. It's important to get your question out so that you know. Tom pointed out that this is the third and final year of this. I'd like to know or get an update in regards to have we developed a new submission to go into Treasury Board next month?
we haven't developed a new submission to go into Treasury board next month, but we have are going to be working through that. It'll take longer than a month to work through that with the NISP's working group, but we have flagged for Indigenous Services Canada at both the departmental level as well as a ministerial level to expect and account for a phase 2 NISP's funding proposal. So they're well aware that that's going to land this fall and in time for the pre-budget submission process. Natan, you were going to say.
Minister Philpott has been very supportive of this particular suicide prevention strategy. She was there at the release, and she's indicated to me support for multi-year phase 2 funding. So we have, in a general sense, the support from the minister. We now have to build the legwork to get the submission in within the timelines that we can work with Indigenous services on.
Could I just stress and suggest again that ITK reach back out to Minister Philpott to emphasize and stress that not only that we are preparing a submission, but that for her to be proactive and ensure that there's a allocation, Inuit specific allocation for us to continue this, since it's something crucial. It's also reconciliation, etc., on all of those issues. But if we don't give her that indication now, then she's going to tell us later that she's going to have to go and seek the funding within the present funds that are allocated by Treasury Board next month anyways. So if she's able to say, we want to see some for that, and we can work on it later.
Pinky?
We're just wondering, how stable is it? Like, can you put into intellect into the security of that progress that has been done so far in terms of multi-year funding, as this is just coming to an end? For example, the things that was built up has only started building momentum. So maybe these people working in Inuvik support for youth programs or the regional outreach worker, maybe they don't even know if they'll have a job next year. So wondering if you could put into intellect if how will this still be secured for the next progress, if you know what I mean. Like, for example, the youth center in Nain, it's been getting real good feedback from the youth in the community. So, but they don't know if they'll be open for the next couple of years. So I'm hoping that within this next proposal that you'll be coming to NIYC for so that we can contribute to this. I'm really wanting to comment that.
In terms of the certainty, I think I would just circle back to what Natan said. The indication that he's received from the minister's office in terms of this is a priority for her. So that's a positive indication from the federal government. In terms of reaching out to NIYC, NIYC will be reached out to for this phase 2 implementation. One of the advantages of phase 2 is we already have a strategy in place, and we will have some lessons learned, and now we can work on, before it actually happens, before we get to April 1st, an implementation plan so that we can hit the ground running on April 1st. But we will involve NIYC in the development of phase 2, similar to how we would involve regions, those sorts of things.
Nakamik, Darlene, did you want to ask a question? Okay, great. Are there any other comments or questions in relation to this item? Just as a general point, this has been a really tough year. There have been many instances of suicide in our communities and many people that we know and love who have died. And sometimes it's really hard to believe in the work that we were doing to prevent suicide when we were still losing people. But we are utilizing the best possible evidence that we have. We have involved Inuit throughout the entire processes to come up with the work that we're trying to do. And we know that there's still a lot of hurt in our communities, and you can't fix that overnight. And I think just being diligent about this is a priority area for organization. Each Inuit region being diligent in making this a priority, as you all have. And then us as our leadership in the leadership pushing this with the federal government or wherever the influence we have. This is going to change the tide, and we are going to make this something that that doesn't affect us in the way that it does today. So I really appreciate everyone's attention to this at the table and your continued support for the national work, and we will do our best at the national level to continue to support in any way that is acceptable the regional and community-based work that needs to be done. Nakamik, everyone, let's take a 10-minute break.
You can call me Becky now.
Walk around and do my own thing. We'll get started as soon as we can. So if everyone could take their seats, herd everyone back in the room, that would be great. YouTube, so I'm pretty sure we can get right about we also are getting the audio recording on phones. Okay, we'll reconvene now. We have clarification that Tyler can take over for Johannes as the lead from Nunatsiavut, which gives us a quorum of 3. Dwayne will be back momentarily. The next item on our agenda is the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee status update. I'd like to ask Tim Argetsinger and Will David to come to the presenters' seats. We've already touched a couple of times on the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee and the work that we've done to date. We have, between the 3 meetings a year, a whole host of activity that happens, whether it's between our executive director, Elizabeth Ford, and then the CEOs of the 4 land claim organizations, or then the senior technical committee that's been struck that Tim and Will lead from the ITK side, that is populated by Inuit leadership, including Pauktutit and ICC Canada. So Tim and Will.
I'd like to start with just the purpose of this update is to provide a high-level review of the work that has happened to date, as well as for those who may not know, just to provide a bit of context for where the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee comes from. Just very quickly on that point, when the current government was elected, they declared that they would utilize a whole of government approach to working to advance Indigenous priorities and issues. At ITK, we immediately realized that the manner in which that commitment was being implemented, which was just individual ministers based on their own personalities and priorities, partnering with Inuit, that wasn't as effective. We developed a white paper, which we shared with INAC in February of 2016, which in really broad strokes outlined what eventually became the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee. So it was in December of 2016, so about 10 months after submitting that white paper, that then the federal government committed to creating the 3 tables for each of the 3 Indigenous peoples in Canada. And it was in February of 2017 that we had the first meeting to identify the initial priorities that we would work on together with federal cabinet ministers and with the Prime Minister. So that's just a bit of background. Since the last meeting of the AGM, the most significant change that has occurred is that since those first priority areas were identified in February of 2017, the first meeting in Iqaluit, the work plans that are associated with those 7 priority areas have been refreshed, and that happened in June of this year here in Inuvik, and there was an additional priority area that was added, which is environment. Just like to draw your attention to page 17 of the annual report. And there is an infographic on page 17 that I think provides a helpful visual for just understanding how the ICPC is structured. Those of you who are online, this annual report is available on our website. Say for the purpose of this update, I'd like to just draw your attention to the 8 priority areas that you see next to the right of the arrow. And those are the current priority areas for this year. So Inuit Crown land claims, Inuit Nunangat policy space. The way that that work is being carried out is really on the Arctic policy framework. Housing, Inuktitut revitalization, maintenance and promotion, reconciliation measures, which encompass some of the apologies that we discussed earlier and related initiatives, education, early learning and training for Inuit, health and wellness, and then environment and climate change. So the vision was that through this more holistic approach, where solutions are discussed between leaders, and that action that then follows from those solutions, that would create a more effective and impactful working relationship that this government had declared an ambition to pursue. So you see in the infographic, on that last box, the outcomes in progress, the completed column on the left. Those items, those refer to some of the actions or commitments that are direct outcomes of the meetings of the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee. So those have been highlighted earlier in the meeting as well, but things such as the Inuit Nunangat specific section in the 2018 federal budget is one example. The commitment and associated funding to eliminate tuberculosis is another example. Just to provide some more details about the actual meetings that have taken place since the last annual general meeting, which is in September of 2017. The ICPC leaders, meaning ministers, cabinet ministers, and Inuit leaders, met in March 2018 in Ottawa, and that was the meeting with the Prime Minister. And that included Minister Bennett for INAC, Minister Jolie for Canadian Heritage, Ministers Duclos and Haidu for ESDC, Minister of Health Petipa Taylor, and Minister McKenna is Minister of Environment. In June, most recently, leaders met here in Inuvik to refresh the work plans that we had initially created together. The purpose of refreshing them really is that this is a sort of been an evolving learning process, but we quickly discovered that the work plans, in order to get the action that we have always envisioned resulting from the process, that the work plans needed to be more specific, that they shouldn't reference or duplicate work that is already ongoing and through other fora or through other processes, and that they should be structured in a way that really is utilizing our capacity here at the table, as well as the capacity of the federal government. In addition to the leaders' meetings, maybe the way that they are used is to consider recommendations or proposed solutions that that ICPC senior officials have recommended for consideration. So that means that at the technical level, people like